Assalamualaikum and good evening to our beloved daughter Azlina and our fellow friends. We are from Black Eagle. The member are myself, Muhammad Akil, Nur Hazira, Nur Fatina Bika, Aimi Shasha and also Nurul Jannah. Our presentation topic for today will be on biological assets. Without wasting any time further, let's move forward. What is biological assets? I'm pretty sure that most of you haven't heard or are familiar with biological assets and under which MFRS it falls into. Before we go further, we need to understand first what is agriculture activity, as biological assets arise due to the agriculture activities. First of all, we need to understand what agricultural activity is. Agricultural activity is the management by entity of the biological transformation and harvest of biological assets. In this process of agricultural activity, it will lead to three situations, which is for sales, for conversion into agricultural produce, or for additional of biological assets. Here we can see the example of agricultural activity. First example is prawn farming. As you can see, prawn farming activity will go through the agricultural activity that which will be turned into sales. Second example is goat farms and broiler. It will be go through the process of agricultural activity that can turn into conversion into agricultural produce or additional of biological assets. As broiler and goat farms will breed and raise, it will be additional of biological asset, and if its purpose for getting their meat, it will be classified under conversion into agricultural produce. Cultivating vineyards will be falls under conversion of agricultural produce because vineyards will be used to produce wines. Next, we'll be moving on into the MFRS versus MPERS. Which MFRS applies for biological assets? The MFRS that we are using is MFRS 141. But do you know that there is a difference between this standard and MPERS? Firstly, MFRS 141 defines that an agricultural activity is the management by an entity of the biological transformation and harvest of biological assets for sale or for conversion into agricultural produce or into additional of biological assets. The keyword is the management. That means the activities that are being managed for the future of economic benefits. Let's say you just have trees for the purpose of putting them in your garden for a display. So those are not a biological asset. These standards should be applied to account for biological assets except for purer plants, which we will go into detail about this term later. While in MPERS Section 34, it's stated that an entity shall recognize all biological assets or agricultural produce when and only when A. The entity controls the asset as a result of past events. B. It is probable that future economic benefit associated with the asset will flow to the entity, and C. The fair value or cost of the asset can be measured reliably without undue cost or effort. That means the difference is in MFRS 141, it is divided by two categories, which is biological assets and burial plant. But in MPERS 34, there is no burial plant. It will be recognized as biological asset when it fulfills the three criteria above. However, currently we are focusing on the MFRS framework, so we will explain further details about this topic in the next slide. As we are focusing on the MFRS framework, we will look at the scope of MFRS 141. Under MFRS 141, it states that this standard shall be applied to account for the following when they relate to agricultural activity. It will be applied to any biological assets except for burial plants. It also will be applied to agricultural produce at the point of harvest and also government grants that covered by Para 34 and 35. Government grants are assistance by government in the form of transfers of resources to an entity. In Para 34, it states that an unconditional government grant related to a biological asset measured at its fair value less cost to sell should be recognized in profit or loss when and only when the government grants become receivable. MFRS 141 does not apply to any burial plants related to agricultural activity, land related to agricultural activity, and also government grants related to burial plants. For burial plants related to agricultural activity, however, this standard will apply to the produce on those burial plants. As you already know the scope of MFRS 141, let's go more into detail further.
Next, we will see what is a biological asset. A biological asset refers to a living animal and plant, or a group of biological assets is an aggregation of similar living animals or plants that is under our management, but here we have an exception of a bare plant that we will explain further. This is an example that we take out from the annual report of Sanderby Plantation 2021 about how biological assets are presented in the financial statement. Biological assets are generally perishable and are like current assets in the balance sheet. As you can see, the biological assets of Sanderby Plantation are cattle, livestock, and produce growing on bare plants, which is growing canes and oil palm. The oil palm represents the fresh fruit bunches or FFB of up to 2 weeks prior to harvest for use in the company's palm products operations. And growing canes represent the standing canes to prior to harvest whereby the values are dependent on the age, sucrose content, and condition as the statement of financial position date. Livestock comprises the cattle livestock included within the company's beef production operation. Cattle livestock are generally fed for 120 days prior to use for beef production. Why is it called livestock? So, the word livestock comes from the sense of stock that means supply for future use. Now, let's see the next example of a financial statement from CCK Consolidated Holding Berhad that comprises the biological assets of broiler breeders, broilers, hatching eggs, prawns farming, and layers. Firstly, broiler breeders are raised for production of day-old broilers and broilers are raised for meat production. Next, the hatching eggs are eggs from domestic layers which are to be used for hatching purposes. CCK Consolidated Holdings Berhad also does a prawn culturing farm and layers are hens that are raised for laying eggs. Just now, in slide 8, I mentioned that in the definition of biological asset MFRS 141 states that have an exception of a bare plant, right? So, what are bare plant? Bare plant is a living plant that is used in the production or supply of agricultural produce that it is expected to bear produce for more than one period. For example, imagine that you plant a mango tree and you pick the mango on the mango tree to sell the mango in the fruit market. In the next mango season, you can still harvest mango from the same tree, right? So, the mango tree is able to produce not only once, but several times for several years. Mango tree is a bare plant under MFRS 116, Plant Property and Equipment, but the fruit on the tree is a biological asset under MFRS 141. Now, what if you grow a rubber tree? The latex that comes from the rubber tree falls under MFRS 141, but the rubber tree itself is a bare plant falls under MFRS 116 because the rubber tree keeps on producing latex. It has a remote likelihood of being sold as agricultural produce except for incidental scrap sales, meaning that if you grow the rubber tree that I mentioned just now, you are not selling the rubber tree, right? If you sell the rubber tree, it will be an incidental scrap sale, but that is not the point of growing the rubber tree. The whole point of growing the rubber tree is normally because we want to get the latex. So, when it fulfills the definition of bare plant, it will recognize under MFRS 116, a property, plant and equipment. Next, let's take a look at how bare plants are disclosed in the financial statement as property, plant and equipment, which is covered under MFRS 116. As we move ahead, in the supplementary to bearer plants note 16a, bearer plants are divided into two categories, which is mature and immature. Mature means it is fully grown and biological transformation is no longer significant in generating future economic benefits. All costs directly related to bearer plants are capitalized until the bearer plants reach maturity. Then, all further costs are expensed and the depreciation begins. Sandobi used the straight line method for the depreciation of its bearer plant, and the estimated useful life is as shown in the slide.
Biological transformation consists of process of growth, degeneration, production, and proliferation that cause qualitative and quantitative changes in biological assets. Biological transformation have two categories, which is animal and plants. Both of these will go through the process of growth, reproduction, and harvest. Based on the process, it will give a qualitative and quantitative effect. Qualitative is where the result from the animals or plants' biological transformation will provide quality to the product produced, while quantitative is where the amount of animal or biological asset produced increase through breeding. Here we can see example of breeding, growth, and harvest. For breeding, we give an example of horse breeding cycle. Through the cycle, we can see the process of the horse giving birth and subsequently becoming a still suckling foal and turning into a foal before it reaches the final stage of becoming an adult. For the right side, plant yields on unharvested plants are known as biological assets. The example given is cabbage. Cabbage is planted to grow and the harvest will be taken as agriculture produce. For harvest, we will give two examples, which is animals and plants. An example of an animal is a chicken, where the chicken will go through the process of agriculture activity and then change to agriculture produce. The harvest from chicken is chicken meat. The plant's example is durian tree. Durian tree also will go through the agriculture activity and then harvest durian fruit will be becoming a agriculture produce. Now we are moving to the agriculture produce. Agriculture produce is the harvest produce of the entity biological asset. The table shows the example of agriculture produce. Based on the example, we can differentiate clearly between the example of bearer plants and also biological asset for plants. One of the examples for bearer plant is palm oil tree. Palm oil tree are the bearer plant, while fresh fruit bunch that attach to palm tree are biological asset. Their agriculture produce are harvest fresh fruit bunch, then after processing it creates palm oil product. Palm oil tree are categorized as bearer plant because it is living plants that use in production or supply agriculture produce more than one period. While in a biological asset, the example of plants would be agar wood. Agar wood will go through the process of agriculture produce, which is harvested gaharu. The resulting product from harvested gaharu is perfume. For this agar wood, it is categorized as biological asset instead of bearer plants. This is because agar wood is a plant that supplies agriculture produce, but it's only for one period, where if we want to agriculture produce again, we need to be reharvest. Agriculture produce were disclosed as inventory as shown is the extraction of SAMW notes to the accounts number 28. Based on SAMW policy, inventory are to be stated at the low of cost and net realizable value.
As you can see from the previous slide are the example of SAMW for their inventories. But now, with reference to QR resources financial statement, we can see under inventories there are layered eggs. But do you remember in slide 10, eggs are categorized under biological assets. How come eggs are also an inventory when we've previously classed them as biological assets? Okay, firstly, we have to understand what is the difference between layer eggs and hatching eggs. Layer eggs produced by the layers chicken are kept as inventories at fair value before they are meant to be sold in the market, while hatching eggs are eggs from domestic layers which are to be used for hatching purposes, a process of breeding which is one example of biological transformation. So the keyword now here is the purpose. Purpose plays an important factor in determining under which section is going to be recorded.
In slide C, we mentioned the difference between MFRS 141 and MPER section 34. To make you understand and difference better, I will explain to you using picture. For the first picture, let's assume that we are using the MFRS framework. In MFRS framework 141, when you grow a fruit tree, you pick the fruits on the tree and sell the fruit to the fruit market. We recognize the fruit tree as a bearer plants which fall under MFRS 116, and the fruits on the tree we recognize as a biological assets under MFRS 141. But if we are using MPERS framework, we recognize both of the fruit tree and the fruits on the tree as biological asset under section 34 in specialized activity. Now, what happens if a cowman raises a cow milk to get their meat? Both the MFRS and MPERS framework recognize it as a biological asset because the meat of the cow is an agriculture product and there is no bearer plant involved in this case.
Moving on to the next important part in this topic, which is recognition of biological assets. Basically, when the biological assets fulfills its definition and its fair value can be measured reliably, the entity may recognize the asset as biological assets. According to MFRS 141 Para 10, these are the criteria for biological assets recognition mentioned in the standard. First, the entity controls the asset as a result of past event, which means it has the ownership on the asset that gives the right to control the asset. Next, it is probable that future economic benefit associated with this asset will flow to the entity. And lastly, the fair value and cost of the asset of the biological asset can be measured reliably. Based on the recognition criteria regarding the reliable fair value measurement, this is how an entity can determine the fair value of biological assets. First, an entity may group them according to their significant attributes such as age and quality to find the exact market price as fair value. An entity may also determine the fair value based on an existing active market by using the price existing in the market where the product is expected to be sold following to the current market conditions. If there is no active market, fair value should be determined on the basis of the most recent transaction prices and market prices for similar assets. Lastly, fair value should be determined independently. Referring to the picture, this is an example of two situations to present the measurement of fair value. The first situation shows that agriculture produce that is still attached to the biological assets at the point of harvest, for example, FFB of palm oil and durian attached to its tree as a biological asset. It will be presented according to MFRS 141 agriculture activities. Meanwhile, the other situation is when the agriculture produce is detached from biological asset at the point of harvest. For example, those plucked FFB and durian are presented according to MFRS 102 inventories or any other applicable standard. We are referring to the extraction of notes to the account of QL Resources Berhad to show how this company measures and determines its fair value. In the guidance provided on fair value measurement, MFRS 13 contains fair value hierarchy that classifies input to use for setting the fair value and set priorities of these inputs. Level 1 inputs are used when there is an active market for similar asset with the same condition. This is by far the most preferred and prioritized method of measurement. For example, this level 1 input is appropriate for agriculture produce like raw milks, eggs, and meat because usually there is a strong active market to derive the fair value of these assets. Also appropriate for consumable biological assets close to their sales or harvest date. Level 2 inputs are used when market determine prices where an active market does not exist. Imagine that some asset would be so rarely traded that the last trade happened long time ago. You can use the most recent price as the input to fair valuation. Another example is when there is a broker quote where observable market information exists for comparable assets and the dealer is willing and able to transact in the assets at that price. That's basically level 2 input. Level 3 inputs are unobservable input for the asset. In agriculture, level 3 is used when there is no active market for the asset in its present condition. This may due to its current age, height, or weight that is unusually traded. In practice, companies use present value of cash flows generated by asset as level 3 input to valuation technique. However, when fair value measurement are determined to be clearly not reliable, that biological asset shall be measured at its cost less any accumulated depreciation and any accumulated impairment losses. QL Resources classify its livestock, hatching eggs, and FFB measured at fair value within level 3 of the fair value hierarchy due to the significant unobservable input. The following table shows the valuation technique used in the determination of fair value within level 3 as well as the significant unobservable input used in the valuation model. The next part is on measurement. The biological asset shall be initially and subsequently measured at the end of each reporting period at its fair value less cost to sell. For example, a 3-year-old cow whose fair value can be measured reliably based on the age has a fair value of 2,000 ringgit will be deducted with its cost to sell for 500 ringgit. For example, any cost of commission, levies, transfer taxes, or duties. So the measurement amount to be present will be 1,500 ringgit. For more details, please refer to slide 28, 29, and 30 for further journal entry illustration. But except for some case where the fair value cannot be measured reliably or initial recognition and at the early stage of assets life, for example, a newborn calf that cannot be measured yet its fair value, and an entity should record it at any cost incurred less any accumulated depreciation and any accumulated impairment losses until the fair value can be measured reliably. For example, the acquisition cost of the asset. Biological assets carried at fair value less cost to sell to comprise of layers, breeders, broilers, and hatching eggs, and also FFB. The movement of the biological assets measured at fair value less cost to sell can be analyzed as shown in the slide. Additions of the biological assets are recognized initially and depopulation of livestock losses and changes in fair value recognized in profit or loss are part of the subsequent measurement. This slide illustrates the initial and subsequent measurement from when a calf, which is a biological asset, is born, and subsequently measure when it becomes 1 year old. The gain and loss regarding biological assets in income statement are as follows. For example, during the initial recognition of biological asset, we need to debit biological asset by 500 ringgit and credit the gain from initial recognition of biological asset by 500 ringgit. After 1 year, when the calf is 1 year old, subsequent measurement is needed. Now we have to debit biological asset by the difference between current fair value less estimated point of sale and fair value less estimated point of sale during initial recognition, which gives us 900 ringgit, and credit gain from change in fair value of biological asset by 900 ringgit. Illustration 2 is about how to calculate fair value less estimated point of sale as what we saw in the previous illustration. The cattle are now marketed locally and also exported to Singapore. Using market price as the fair value of the cattle less all the point of sale costs incurred, in this case transport costs and commissions to the broker, we can now calculate the fair value less point of sale costs for both market, local and Singapore as shown in this slide.
Now that we are familiar and understand the classification of each item related to the agriculture activities, I am confident that all of us can easily classify them appropriately. Yes, the presentation is as follows. Biological assets are presented as current assets in the statement of financial position under MFRS 141. Agriculture products which are kept by the entity are presented as inventory according to MFRS 102 in the statement of financial position, while bureau plants are treated as property, plant and equipment under MFRS 116. Here is our selected issue related to our topic that was published on Astro Awani on 4 June 2022, which is the shortage of chicken supply. Based on the issue, we are highlighting the accounting treatment to write off insufficient chicken supply due to climate change and disease and also the other risks. This issue is talking about the shortage of chicken supply because of the climate change, disease and the open cage, and also unscheduled chicken vaccination process that leads to the excess of chicken stocks that cannot be sold and used. Referring to MFRS 141 paragraph 53, poultry stocks that cannot be sold due to climate exposure and also other natural risks should be written off as expenses regarding its loss, as it will give rise to a material item of income or expenses. It will be disclosed in accordance to MFRS 101 presentation of income statement under profit and loss income statement. Our second selected issue is published on the Star on 7 January 2022 that is discussing about the fluctuation of chicken price effect the fair value of it. The highlight of the issue is the determination of fair value due to the price fluctuation. Based on the article provided, chicken selling price is getting higher because of the factor of high operating costs and important animal feed for farmers to keep the production of chicken. Due to the high cost, it gives impact to the chicken price to increase due to the consumer's demand over chicken supply. This issue is about to discuss that the fluctuation price will be the determination of fair value because the fair value can be measured reliably based on the existing active market following to current market conditions in accordance of MFRS 141. Referring to MFRS 13 fair value, valuation technique applied is market approach using the level 2, which is market determined price. An entity use prices and other relevant information generated by market transactions involving identical or comparable.